The air in the Croft Grand Ballroom was not merely air. It was a currency thick with the scent of money old and new. It smelled of hothouse lilies flown in from the equator, of vintage perfume dabbed on wrists adorned with platinum, and of the faint metallic tang of ambition. Crystal chandeliers, each a constellation of captured starlight, dripped light onto a sea of tailored tuxedos and silk gowns. On the raised dais, a frantic but polished auctioneer was coaxing another $100,000 from a shipping magnate for a minimalist sculpture that looked like a tangle of chrome ribbons. Alara Vance moved through this glittering ecosystem like a phantom. Her black and white server's uniform was a stark vessel of invisibility, designed to be present but unseen. With a silver tray balanced expertly on one hand, she navigated the clusters of guests, her expression a perfect mask of serene neutrality. But behind her calm, dark eyes, she was not serene. She was cataloging, analyzing, observing. The slight tremor in the hand of a banker bidding too high, the almost imperceptible exchange of glances between a senator and his rival's wife, the way Isabella Croft's smile never ever reached her cold sapphire blue eyes. Isabella Croft, the matriarch, was the room's gravitational center. Seated at the primary table, draped in a gown the color of clotted blood, she was a portrait of aristocratic power. Every nod was a command, every sip of her wine a judgment. Her gaze swept the room, missing nothing, least of all the silent, efficient server who had for the past month moved through her home with a quiet competence that felt less like servitude and more like surveillance. Alara felt the weight of that gaze. It was a physical pressure, a prickling on the back of her neck that she had become accustomed to. She refilled a glass with champagne, the golden liquid whispering into the crystal flute, and caught a flicker of movement across the room. Julian. He stood near the French doors leading to the terrace, a solitary figure amidst the throng. As the heir to the Croft Empire, he should have been at the center of the room, glad-handing investors and charming philanthropists. Instead, he watched his posture, rigid, his handsome face a study in stoic detachment. His eyes, the same piercing blue as his mother's, but without the frost, met Alara's for a fraction of a second. There was no warmth in the look, no secret acknowledgement of an illicit affair. It was something else entirely, a confirmation, a silent command to proceed. The chrome sculpture was finally sold for a sum that could have funded a small hospital for a year. A polite ripple of applause washed through the room. In the momentary lull, as waiters began to circulate with a new course of canapés, Isabella made her move. She did not rise with dramatic flair. She simply stood, a fluid and deadly motion, and the room's low hum of conversation seemed to falter, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. She took a few steps away from her table, her progress intercepting Alara's path with predator's precision. "Excuse me." Dear Isabella's voice was smooth as velvet, yet it sliced through the ambient noise, drawing a dozen pairs of eyes. Alara stopped, her tray held steady. "Yes, Mrs. Croft." Her tone was perfectly pitched, respectful, quiet, unremarkable. Isabella's eyes dropped from Alara's face to the column of her throat, where the delicate chain of a simple silver locket rested against her skin, a stark contrast to the severe black collar of her uniform. "That locket," Isabella said, her voice growing colder, louder. "It's a quaint piece. Where did a girl like you acquire it? A girl like you." The words hung in the air, weighted with disdain. The nearby conversations died completely. Guests turned their faces, a mixture of curiosity and bloodthirsty anticipation. They smelled a scandal, a welcome diversion from the polite tedium of philanthropy. Alara's hand instinctively went to the locket, a gesture she immediately regretted for its defensiveness. "It was a gift, madam." "A gift?" Isabella gave a short, brittle laugh. "From whom? Surely not from your wages." "I've seen it before. It belonged to the staff collection's small trinkets kept in the East Wing for seniority rewards. You have not been here long enough to earn such a reward." She took another step closer, her voice rising to a sharp, accusatory pitch that carried to the far corners of the hall. "So I will ask again. Where did you get it?" Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. This was the moment. The fuse had been lit. She kept her voice even, a feat of immense control. "I believe you are mistaken, Mrs. Croft. This has been in my possession for many years." "Liar," Isabella hissed. The word was a physical blow. "You come into my house, serve my guests, and steal from under my very nose. You think because it is a trifle no one will notice. You think we are fools. And then, before anyone could react, before Alara could brace herself, Isabella lunged. Her manicured fingers, cold and strong, curled around the front of Alara's uniform. With a single violent tug, she ripped the fabric straight down the center. The sound was shockingly loud in the silent room, a dry, tearing shriek of cotton parting ways. Gasps erupted. A woman dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering on the marble floor with a sharp musical crash. Alara stumbled back, her hands flying to her chest to cover the exposed white satin of her camisole. The silver locket swung wildly against her skin, a pendulum marking a moment of pure, calculated humiliation. Her face burned a hot tide of shame and fury. But as Isabella stood back, her chest heaving with righteous indignation, the locket thrown by the force of the assault fell. Its chain snapped. It hit the polished floor not with a clatter, but with a soft metallic thud, and sprang open. There, nestled in the velvet lining of the tiny silver heart, was not a miniature portrait or a lock of hair. It was a symbol. A small, strange sigil etched into the silver, a serpent coiled around a key, its eye a minuscule speck of onyx. The symbol seemed to pulse in the opulent light, an alien artifact in a world of curated beauty. It drew the eye, a question mark made of metal. The crowd murmured, confused. Isabella herself frowned, the locket's contents not matching her narrative of simple theft. This was something else. Something she did not recognize. It was then that Julian moved. He did not rush. He did not shout. He crossed the room in long, purposeful strides, his chair scraping back with a definitive sound of finality. The crowd parted for him, a silent wave receding from a stony shore. He ignored the shocked faces, the whispers, the shattered glass. His focus was absolute. He did not go to Alara. He did not wrap her in his jacket or offer a comforting word. He walked directly to where the locket lay on the floor and crouched, picking it up with steady fingers. He studied the symbol for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable. Then he straightened, closing the locket with a soft click. He turned not to Alara but to his mother. His voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of all emotion. It was as cold and clear as glacial ice, and it froze the very air in the ballroom. "Mother," he said, the word a quiet condemnation. "Your theatrics are as always impressive, but they are unnecessary." Isabella's triumphant expression faltered, confusion clouding her eyes. "Julian, this woman is a thief. I caught her red-handed." "You caught nothing," Julian replied, his voice flat. He pocketed the locket. "Because there was nothing to catch. Miss Vance is not a thief." He let the statement hang for a beat, allowing its full weight to settle. Then he delivered the final devastating blow. "She is here at my personal invitation. Her employment at this estate serves a purpose far more important than serving champagne." His eyes, so like his mother's, locked onto hers, and for the first time Alara saw a flicker of something truly dangerous in their depths. A purpose you of all people should be wary of. A collective silent gasp seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. The statement was not a defense. It was a threat. It was a declaration of a hidden war. It reframed everything. Alara was not a victim, or a lover, or a thief. She was a weapon. And Julian had just announced to the world that he was pointing her directly at his own mother. Isabella stared at her son, her face a mask of disbelief, the color draining from her cheeks. Her perfect public trap had not just failed. It had detonated in her hands, revealing a game she didn't even know she was playing. Alara stood clutching the torn pieces of her uniform, her heart still pounding. The shame had receded, replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. The humiliation had been the cost of entry, the price for this very moment. Julian had played his part perfectly. The guests stood frozen, their minds reeling, trying to piece together the fragments of the drama. The narrative had shattered. This was no longer a simple story of a rich boy and a poor girl. This was a palace coup, announced not with swords, but with a few chillingly calm sentences. The torn veil of civility had been ripped away, and what lay beneath was something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The journey from the grand ballroom to the sanctuary of Julian's private study was a silent, charged procession. Julian did not take Alara's hand. He simply walked a half step ahead of her, his broad shoulders carving a path through the stunned and whispering sea of guests. His pace was not hurried, but it was inexorable, a force of nature that brooked no obstacle. Alara followed in his wake, the torn fabric of her uniform, a flag of her public humiliation, her composure the armor that held her together. She could feel the stares, hundreds of them like tiny sharp needles against her skin. She heard the sibilant hiss of speculation, the sharp intake of breath, the rustle of silk as heads turned to follow their exit. They passed Isabella, who stood frozen near her table, her face a mask of incandescent fury. Her eyes locked with Alara's, and in their sapphire depths Alara saw not just hatred, but the dawning of a terrible cold fear. The fear of an unknown enemy who had just breached her fortress walls. They did not speak as they traversed the long portrait-lined corridors of the Croft estate, their footsteps echoing on the cold marble. Only when Julian pushed open a heavy oak door and ushered her inside, closing it with a definitive sound-dampening click, did the world outside cease to exist. The study was Julian's sanctum, a room that smelled of old leather books, and the faint, clean scent of his cologne. It was a space of masculine order, of dark wood, and subdued lighting, the opposite of the glittering chaos they had just left. A massive mahogany desk stood before a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the rain-slicked, manicured gardens now shrouded in darkness. Alara finally allowed herself to breathe, her shoulders slumping slightly as she clutched the ruined front of her blouse. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a tremor in its wake. "It worked," she said, her voice a low murmur breaking the thick silence. She took the bait. Julian turned from the door, his face impassive in the dim light. "It worked too well. I hadn't anticipated her physically assaulting you." He gestured to a leather armchair. "Sit." It was not a request. She sat, her body sinking into the cool, supple leather. He walked to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy glass. He didn't offer her one. He drank it himself, downing half the contents in a single sharp swallow. Her reaction was primal. He set his back to her as he stared out the window. The locket was a generic plant. "I expected a verbal accusation, a scene, but not that. It confirms she is more unstable than I thought." The memory of their first meeting felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 6 weeks. It had not been in a grand estate, but in a cramped, dusty office above a bookshop, a neutral territory chosen by Alara. The air had smelled of decaying paper and rain. Julian Croft had looked out of place there, his bespoke suit a stark contrast to the peeling paint and cluttered shelves. He had found her through a discreet referral, a name passed between the kind of powerful people who required problems to disappear quietly. She was known then not as Alara Vance, but by a pseudonym, a ghost who specialized in asset recovery and internal risk assessment, a sanitized term for finding things and people who did not wish to be found. He had laid out the case with cold precision, his voice a low, steady monotone. "My father, Arthur Croft, died 10 years ago. He fell from the upper terrace of the West Wing. It was late, it had been raining. The official ruling was accidental death." Alara had listened without interruption, her hands folded on the rickety desk between them. "You don't believe it was." "I believe the narrative is incomplete," Julian had corrected. "My father was a brilliant, ruthless man. He was also meticulous. He was not the type to get drunk and slip on a wet stone. And there were inconsistencies. A missing watch he never took off. A financial transfer made from his personal account an hour after his time of death. The police were encouraged by my mother to close the case quickly, to avoid a scandal." "You suspect your mother," Alara stated, her gaze unwavering. A muscle had tightened in his jaw. "I suspect my mother values the family name above all else, including the truth. She and my father had a volatile relationship. He was planning to make significant changes to the company, charter changes that would have diluted her power. After his death, those plans vanished. My mother assumed full control of his seat on the board. 'What do you want from me?' she had asked. 'I want the truth.' He'd set, his blue eyes finally showing a flicker of the fire he kept so carefully banked. 'I want you on the inside. My mother is insulated. No one can get close. But she is also proud, and she has a blind spot for those she considers beneath her. The staff, the help.' He slid a file across the desk. 'I've arranged a position for you on the household staff. You are Alara Vance, an orphan with a clean but unremarkable work history. You will serve, you will listen, you will watch. I want to know what she is hiding.' Alara had opened the file. Inside was a meticulously crafted identity, a contract and a signing bonus that could have bought the entire building they were in. The risk was immense. If Isabella Croft discovered her, she would not be dismissed. She would be destroyed. But Alara's own past was a landscape of ashes. She had been framed, disgraced, and cast out of her former life. This was more than a job. It was a chance to use the skills that had once been her pride, a chance to face a titan like Isabella, and not flinch. The first step, she had said, closing the file, is to make her see me. We need to provoke her, but in a way that seems accidental. A test. To see how she reacts under pressure when she believes she has all the power. That test had been the locket. The symbol was a good touch, Julian said, turning from the window. The brandy had done nothing to soften the hard lines of his face. It introduced an element of the unknown. It rattled her. She expected a simple thief, not a mystery. She will be looking for answers now, Alara said, her voice regaining its strength. She'll investigate me, my history. The history I created for you is ironclad. It will lead her to a dead end. He walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a simple cashmere shawl. He held it out to her. Here, cover yourself. She took at the soft wool, a strange comfort against her chilled skin. Their fingers brushed a spark of unexpected heat in the cold room. Alara pulled her hand back as if burned. For the first time, a crack appeared in their professional armor. The air between them shifted, becoming heavier, more intimate. He was no longer just her client. He was the man who had just stood before the world and tied his fate to hers. I will have your quarters moved to the East Wing, he said, his voice a little rougher than before. It will give you more access, and it will be seen as a reward for your loyalty to me. It will infuriate my mother further. Keep her off balance. And you, Alara asked, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders. You've declared war on her publicly. She will not take that lightly. Let her come, he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. I've been waiting for this war for 10 years. Unseen by them across the estate, Marcus Thorne stood on the terrace, a cigar smoldering between his fingers. He had watched the entire spectacle unfold with the keen interest of a chess master observing a rival's unexpected move. Julian's public declaration was bold, reckless, and utterly fascinating. It signaled a deep fracture in the House of Croft, and fractures were where men like Marcus found their fortune. His initial suspicion had been directed at Julian, but as the heir had led the server away, Marcus had gotten a clear, unobstructed view of the woman's face. The way she held herself, the defiant lift of her chin, the intelligence in her eyes, it struck a chord of memory, distant but sharp. He took a long drag from his cigar, the ember glowing in the dark. The Vance girl. The name came to him suddenly. It couldn't be. The woman from the St. Clair Gallery incident 5 years ago. The brilliant young art historian and recovery specialist who had been the rising star of her field until a priceless Renaissance miniature went missing and she had taken the fall. The evidence against her had been overwhelming, but Marcus, who had been a junior lawyer on the periphery of the case, had always thought it was too neat, too perfect. She had vanished after that, her career and reputation in ruins. And now here she was, masquerading as a maid in the Croft estate at the center of a power play initiated by the heir himself. A slow, predatory smile spread across Marcus Thorne's face. This was no simple affair. This was an operation. Julian Croft had hired a professional, and if Alara Vance was involved, the stakes were infinitely higher than just a family squabble. This was about something buried, something valuable enough to risk everything for. He extinguished his cigar against the stone balustrade. The game had just become far more interesting, and Marcus Thorne always made sure he was on the winning side. Alone in her new room in the East Wing, a spacious, elegantly appointed suite that was a world away from the Spartan servers' quarters, Alara finally let the mask fall. She sank onto the edge of the silk-covered bed, her body trembling with delayed shock. She had faced down Isabella Croft. She had survived, but it was only the first move in a deadly game. Julian's words echoed in her mind, a purpose you, of all people, should be wary of. He had not just defended her, he had weaponized her. And as she looked at her reflection in the ornate mirror, she felt the undeniable, dangerous pull of the man who had hired her for a contract of thorns. It was a partnership forged in secrets and shadows, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that it would demand a price far higher than the one specified in their agreement. It would demand a piece of her soul. The Croft estate operated on a rhythm of silent, flawless efficiency. It was a world unto itself, a perfectly calibrated machine of polished silver hushed footsteps and secrets kept behind gilded doors. In her new role as Julian's personal assistant, Alara was granted access to the machine's inner workings. Her days were a carefully constructed performance of scheduling Julian's appointments, transcribing his notes and managing his correspondence, all of which were a meticulous fiction. Her real work began in the quiet moments between the chimes of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was in the study of the estate's original blueprints, which she'd found in the archives under the guise of locating historical property deeds. It was in the observation of the aging head butler, whose loyalty to Isabella was absolute, but whose memory was beginning to fray at the edges. It was in the mapping of the CCTV cameras, noting their blind spots and the predictable patterns of their sweeps. The house was her adversary, a labyrinth of stone and memory, and she was learning its secrets one shadowed corridor at a time. Her official presence at Julian's side was both a shield and a spotlight. The staff watched her with a mixture of fear and resentful curiosity. To them, she was the upstart server who had somehow bewitched the air, a modern-day Cinderella with an unsettling edge. They gave her a wide berth, their whispers ceasing the moment she entered a room. This isolation, while lonely, was a tactical advantage. No one sought to befriend her, which meant no one was watching her too closely. Her interactions with Julian remained carefully circumscribed. In public, they were the distant employer and his efficient assistant. In the privacy of his study, they were co-conspirators, their conversations brief, analytical, and devoid of the strange electric tension that hummed just beneath the surface. He never mentioned the auction again, nor the feel of his cashmere shawl on her skin, but sometimes she would look up from her work and find him watching her, his expression a complex mixture of calculation and an emotion she dared not name. Her investigation inevitably led her to the old staff wing. It was a part of the house that had been largely abandoned, a relic from an era of more plentiful live-in servants. Most of the current staff lived in modern annexes or off the estate entirely. According to the old rosters she'd uncovered, the wing was now used for little more than storage. It was also where her mother, Anya Vance, had lived and slept for the 15 years she had served the Croft family. Under the pretense of conducting an inventory of antique furniture, Ilara secured the keys. The air in the wing was stale, thick with the dust of forgotten years. Sunlight struggled through grimy windows, illuminating ghostly shapes draped in white sheets. The silence here was different, not the polished silence of the main house, but the heavy, sorrowful silence of abandonment. She found her mother's room at the end of a long hallway. The number 27 was still faintly visible on the door. It was unlocked. The space was small, Spartan, containing only a simple iron bed frame and a rickety wooden wardrobe, both covered in dust. It was a room for an invisible person, a space to be occupied between hours of tireless service. A wave of profound sadness washed over Ilara. This tiny, forgotten box was the only home her mother had known for more than a decade. She began her search, her movements methodical and quiet. She checked the wardrobe, the bed frame, the loose molding along the walls. Nothing. It felt like a dead end, a cold trail left by a ghost. Disappointment settled in her chest, heavy and cold. As she was about to leave, her foot scuffed against a floorboard near the window. It shifted just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. Her heart quickened. She knelt, her fingers probing the edges of the board. It was loose. Using the tip of a letter opener she carried, she pried it up. Beneath it lay a hollow space, and nestled inside that space was a small oilcloth-wrapped parcel. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was heavy for its size. Unwrapping the cloth, she revealed a small leather-bound diary, its cover worn smooth with time. There was no lock. With a deep, steadying breath, she opened it. The handwriting was her mother's, a fine, elegant script that seemed at odds with the life of a maid. The first several pages were what one might expect, observations about the weather, notes on her duties, mentions of a young, brooding Julian. But as Ilara turned the pages, the entries grew more cryptic, the language more veiled. It was less a diary and more a coded ledger of fear. October 12th. One entry read, "The Queen is restless tonight. The storm in her eyes matches the one outside. She polishes her cage until it gleams, but she is still a prisoner." November 3rd. He spoke of it again, of selling the sky to the highest bidder. He does not understand that some stars are not meant to be sold. They are meant to be kept, to be guarded. The Queen sees this. She would rather the sky go dark than let him give it away. Ilara's breath caught. The Queen had to be Isabella. He was Arthur Croft. But what was the sky? What were the stars? Then she found the entry that made her blood run cold. December 1st. The star of the Aegean is too bright. It burns. He wears it like a trophy, but it is a curse. I fear what it makes him do. I fear the serpent in the garden even more. The serpent whispers to both the king and the queen, and its venom poisons everything. Tonight I did what I must. I have hidden its light where only a shadow can find it. May God forgive me. The star of the Aegean. The name resonated in Alara's memory. It was a legendary sapphire, a massive, flawless stone of impossible blue that had been in the Croft family for generations, rumored to have been lost in a fire a decade ago around the same time Arthur Croft had died. Her mother hadn't been a simple maid caught in the crossfire of a wealthy family's drama. She had been an active participant. She had hidden a priceless jewel, and she had been terrified of someone she called the Serpent. This changed everything. This was no longer just Julian's mission. It was hers. It was the echo of her mother's whisper, a plea for truth sent across a decade of silence. In her sun-drenched private parlor, Isabella Croft was not feeling the warmth. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The girl Ilara was a problem that was metastasizing. The public defiance, Julian's shocking declaration, it had all shifted the ground beneath her feet. She had summoned Marcus Thorne because the subtle touch of a matriarch was no longer sufficient. She needed the blunt instrument of a lawyer. "She has to go," Isabella said, dispensing with pleasantries, as Marcus took a seat opposite her. "I don't care what it takes. Find a reason. A crime, a moral failing. Plant it if you must. I want her gone from this house and out of my son's life." Marcus steepled his fingers, his expression calm, almost placid. It was a look that always unsettled her. "Removing her may be more complicated than you imagine, Isabella." "Complicated," she scoffed. "She is a servant, a nobody. Julian is infatuated, but infatuation fades. We simply need to accelerate the process." "That is where you are mistaken," Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly. "She is not a nobody. In fact, she is very much a somebody." He leaned forward. "Her name is Alara Vance. 5 years ago, she was the most promising art crimes investigator in the country. She specialized in recovering stolen antiquities. Until the St. Clair Gallery theft. A miniature by Da Vinci vanished, and the evidence led directly to her. She was professionally ruined, disgraced. Isabella stared at him, her regal composure cracking. "An investigator. Julian hired an investigator." The words felt like ash in her mouth. The fear she'd felt at the auction solidified into a cold, hard dread. This was not about love. It was about the past. "It would seem so," Marcus continued, smoothly savoring her shock. "He hasn't brought a stray dog into his home, Isabella. He has unleashed a wolf. And she is not sniffing around for his affection. She is hunting. The question is what for?" Isabella's mind raced, connecting the dots with sickening speed. The girl's poise, her unnerving calm, her calculated provocation with the locket. It was all a performance, a professional at work. And there was only one secret in this house worth hunting for. "You will handle this," Isabella commanded, her voice regaining its steel, though her hands trembled slightly where they gripped the arms of her chair. "You will get rid of her." "Of course," Marcus said with a thin smile. "But my services in a matter this delicate will require a revised compensation structure and a more formal role in the company's strategic decisions. I can be your most valuable ally in this, or I can be a neutral observer who simply provides counsel to whoever is in power. Julian, for instance." It was blackmail wrapped in the silken language of a corporate negotiation. He knew she was vulnerable, and he was pressing his advantage without mercy. He was the serpent. The serpent in the garden. The realization hit Isabella with the force of a physical blow. Her husband had trusted Marcus. She had trusted Marcus. And all this time he had been coiling, waiting. She looked at the man before her, his placid face, his watchful eyes, and she saw him for what he was, a patient predator. She was trapped. To fight Alara, she needed Marcus. And to have Marcus, she had to give him the one thing she held most dear: power. "Very well, Marcus," she said, the words tasting like poison. "You will have what you want. Now tell me, how do we destroy Alara Vance?" Marcus Thorne leaned back in his chair, a look of serene satisfaction on his face. "We won't destroy her," he said softly. "We will let her destroy herself. We just need to build the perfect stage for her to do it on." The alliance between Isabella Croft and Marcus Thorne was not forged in fire, but in ice. Their planning sessions, held in the sterile quiet of the estate's conservatory, were models of cold corporate precision. Surrounded by the vibrant, chaotic beauty of exotic orchids, they plotted Alara's downfall with the dispassion of surgeons discussing an incision. "The documents are ready," Marcus said one afternoon 2 days before the annual Croft Foundation garden party. He slid a slim leather folio across the glass table. "They are forgeries, of course, but of the highest quality. Encrypted emails, transaction logs, offshore account details. They paint a very clear picture. Miss Vance has been systematically leaking sensitive data from the upcoming North Atlantic acquisition to a shell corporation. A corporation that can be traced back to a competitor." Isabella picked up a sample page, her eyes scanning the meticulous details. A faint, appreciative smile touched her lips. "Impeccable. It suggests not just treachery, but greed. It makes her predictable. Common." "Precisely," Marcus agreed. "It attacks the foundation of her value to Julian. He hired her for her skills and discretion. This will make him see her as an unacceptable liability. A professional betrayal is far more damaging to a man like Julian than a personal one." "And the placement?" Isabella asked, setting the page down. "I have a footman, Thomas. He has a gambling problem and a convenient lack of moral fiber. He will be on duty during the party. While all eyes are on the gardens, he will place the folio in the bottom drawer of the desk in her new suite. It's a place anyone would look for business files." "Good," Isabella murmured, her gaze drifting to a blood-red orchid. "And I will handle the stage. The garden party is the perfect venue. We will surround her with a world she cannot hope to belong to. We will make her feel like an insect under glass. Every smile will be a judgment, every conversation a test she is doomed to fail." By the end of the day, Marcus finished his voice a soft final note. Julian will have no choice but to believe that the woman he brought into his house is not a partner, but a parasite. The day of the garden party dawned with a kind of aggressive perfection. The sky was a flawless, cloudless blue, and the sprawling Croft gardens were a masterpiece of controlled nature. Roses the size of fists climbed ancient stone walls. Fountains whispered secrets into lily ponds, and a string quartet played Vivaldi from a pristine white gazebo. Alara was required to attend at Julian's side. It was a non-negotiable part of her cover as his assistant. She wore a simple, elegant sundress of pale gray linen, a color chosen to be unobtrusive to fade into the background. But there was no fading for the woman at the center of the Croft scandal. As she walked with Julian across the manicured lawn, she felt the conversations falter, the heads turn the weight of 100 speculative gazes. She was a curiosity, a piece of live theater for the bored and the powerful. She maintained her practiced composure, a slight pleasant smile fixed on her face, but her senses were on high alert. She was not a guest. She was a soldier on enemy terrain. Every corner of the garden, every smiling face was a potential threat. Julian was a fortress of conflicting tensions beside her. To the world, he was the calm, confident heir, greeting senators and CEOs with a firm handshake and a cool smile. He kept Alara close, a proprietary hand occasionally resting on the small of her back, a gesture that was both a claim and a warning. But Alara could feel the coiled tightness in his shoulders, see the way his eyes constantly scanned the crowd, anticipating the next attack. He was caught between his duty to his world and his loyalty to their mission, and the strain was beginning to show. Enjoying the party, Miss Vance, Marcus Thorne materialized beside them, his own smile as smooth and pleasant as a polished stone. "It's a beautiful event, Mr. Thorne," Alara replied, her voice even. "Indeed. A testament to Isabella's meticulous planning," he said, his eyes glinting. "One must admire her ability to cultivate beauty. And to weed out pests, of course." The veiled threat was unmistakable. He was showing her that he knew that he was part of the game. Before Alara could respond, Isabella herself glided towards them, a vision in floral silk. "Julian, darling, Senator Powell has been asking for you." Her smile was radiant, but when her eyes fell on Alara, they were chips of ice. "Miss Vance, you look so simple. It's refreshing." It was an endless parade of such moments, tiny paper cuts of condescension and veiled hostility. Alara navigated them with flawless grace, her composure a shield that seemed to infuriate Isabella more than any outburst could have. She knew this was the purpose of the party, to isolate her, to unnerve her, to prove she did not belong. She felt like she was walking through a field of expertly hidden landmines. As the sun reached its zenith, casting long shadows across the lawn, a footman named Thomas moved with practiced invisibility through the east wing. His heart hammered against his ribs, his hands slick with sweat. He clutched the leather folio to his chest, the bribe money from Mr. Thorne, a heavy, guilty weight in his pocket. He slipped into Ilara's suite, the silence of the room amplifying the sound of his own ragged breathing. He opened the bottom drawer of her desk, placed the folio inside, nestled beneath a stack of blank stationery, and closed it with a soft click. The task was done. He was out in the corridor seconds later, melting back into the life of the house the serpent's venom successfully delivered. Back in the garden, the atmosphere grew heavier. Isabella, seeing that her social barbs were having little visible effect on Ilara, decided to escalate. She stepped onto the gazebo, tapping a glass for attention. "My dear friends," she began, her voice carrying across the lawn, "thank you all for coming to support the foundation. As we look to the future, we are reminded of the importance of a strong legacy. A legacy built on tradition, integrity, and most importantly, on impeccable judgment." Her gaze landed on Julian and Ilara and held there. It is a reminder that a house, no matter how strong its foundations, can be compromised from within by poor choices and misguided loyalties. The attack was stunning in its public audacity. A shocked murmur went through the crowd. Julian's face hardened, his hand tightening on Ilara's arm. She could feel the anger radiating from him, a controlled fury that made the air around them crackle. He started to step forward to speak, but Ilara's fingers gently squeezed his arm, a silent plea to wait. Reacting now in anger was what they wanted. The party began to wind down an hour later, the tension of Isabella's speech having poisoned the idyllic atmosphere. As guests began to depart, Marcus made his final move. He approached Julian, his expression one of mild professional concern. "Julian," he said, keeping his voice low, "a quick word before I go. I was reviewing the quarterly projections, and I noticed a discrepancy in the initial reports for the North Atlantic acquisition. I believe I left a query on your desk, but with the party preparations, I imagine things have been hectic. Perhaps your assistant has already had a chance to file them away for you." It was the perfect bait. Subtle, professional, and entirely plausible. It gave Julian a legitimate reason to look through his files, and by extension the files now managed by his assistant. It was not an accusation. It was a simple business inquiry. But it was a key turning in a lock that would open a door to ruin. "I'll look into it," Julian said. His tone clipped his mind, clearly still on his mother's public insult. "Excellent," Marcus said with a final pleasant smile. He nodded to Ilara. "Miss Vance." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the thinning crowd, his work complete. The trap was now set. Every piece was in its place. The evidence was planted. The seed of professional concern had been sown. And the target, Julian, was now unknowingly on a path to spring it himself. Ilara watched Marcus go, a cold dread washing over her. She didn't know the specifics of the trap, but she knew with absolute certainty that it had just been armed. She looked at Julian, who was staring grimly after his departing guests, his mind already turning to the work that awaited him and to the query Marcus had so cleverly planted. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her feet, waiting for the final inevitable fall. The last of the guests had departed, leaving behind a wake of trampled grass, abandoned champagne flutes, and the lingering scent of expensive perfume. An army of staff moved silently through the gardens, restoring order with practiced efficiency. For the Croft estate, the party was over. For Julian, the battle was just beginning. He stood in his study, the doors closed against the quiet hum of the cleanup, his mother's words still ringing in his ears. Compromised from within by poor choices and misguided loyalties. It had been a public declaration of war, and she had used him as the battlefield. He loosened his tie, a knot of fury tightening in his chest. To distract himself, to anchor his mind to the solid, predictable world of numbers and contracts, he remembered Marcus's query. The North Atlantic acquisition. It was a mundane task, a welcome refuge. He sifted through the papers on his own desk first, finding nothing. His own files were in perfect order. "Perhaps your assistant has already had a chance to file them away for you." Marcus's words echoed with an innocence that now seemed suspect. With a heavy sigh, he walked to the adjoining office that had been assigned to Ilara. It was a small but elegant space, her presence already imprinted upon it in subtle ways. The neat stacks of paper, the single pen laid perfectly parallel to a notepad. The faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her. He felt a pang of something he refused to analyze, a protective instinct mixed with a deep, unsettling admiration for the woman who had faced his mother's venom and had not even flinched. He opened the top drawers of her desk. Everything was meticulously organized: correspondence schedules, research notes. Nothing related to the acquisition. He moved to the bottom drawer. It was deeper, meant for larger files. His fingers brushed against a stack of stationery, and underneath he felt the cool, smooth leather of a folio. He pulled it out. It was slim black and unmarked. Assuming it was the file he was looking for, he carried it back to his own desk. He poured himself a brandy, the fiery liquid of familiar comfort, and sat down, opening the cover. The first page was not a financial projection. It was a copy of an encrypted email. Julian frowned, his eyes scanning the text. It was addressed to an anonymous offshore server and detailed a critical vulnerability in the Croft Corporation's cybersecurity, specifically around the servers hosting the North Atlantic acquisition data. The sender's signature was a simple, untraceable code name. The date was from 3 nights ago. His blood ran cold. He turned the page, and another, and another. It was all there. Transaction logs showing small but significant payments from the shell corporation Marcus had mentioned into a newly opened bank account. Internal memos marked with the highest level of security copied verbatim. A detailed timeline of the acquisition's final stages. It was a complete systematic blueprint of corporate espionage. And on the last page, a bank statement for the new account, the one receiving the payments. The account holder's name was listed clearly, Alara Vance. The glass in Julian's hand trembled. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. It couldn't be. It was too blatant, too perfect. A trap. His mind screamed that it was a trap. But the evidence was overwhelming, meticulous, and professionally compiled. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a comprehensive case file for the prosecution. The folio felt like a lead weight in his hands, each page a testament to a betrayal so profound it stole the air from his lungs. The professional trust he had placed in her was the foundation of their entire arrangement. And this document suggested she had taken that trust and systematically dismantled it for profit. He didn't shout. He didn't throw the glass against the wall. A cold, terrifying calm settled over him. He pressed the intercom button on his desk, his voice a low, gravelly thing he barely recognized. "Miss Vance, my study. Now." Alara arrived within minutes. She had changed from her dress into simple black trousers and a silk blouse, her face scrubbed clean of any makeup, her hair pulled back severely. She looked like a scholar, a strategist, not the woman at the center of a society scandal. She entered the study and knew instantly that something was wrong. The air was frigid, all the latent warmth between them gone. Julian sat behind his desk, his face carved from stone, his eyes holding a new, chilling darkness. "Close the door," he commanded. She did. On the polished surface of the desk between them lay the black leather folio. She recognized it with a jolt. It was not hers. "I was looking for the North Atlantic files," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Instead, I found this. In your desk." He pushed the folio towards her. "Explain it." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she opened the folio. She read the first page, then the second, her mind racing. The hurt came first, a sharp physical blow to her chest. The fact that he could even for a moment believe this. Then the investigator took over. Her eyes scanned the documents not for their content but for their construction. She analyzed the details, the formatting, the language. It was good. It was very, very good. But it wasn't perfect. She looked up, meeting his cold, accusatory gaze. "Where did you find this exactly?" "Don't play games with me, Alara. In the bottom drawer of your desk. A desk in a room that any of the dozens of staff members who are loyal to your mother could access, especially during a party where I was deliberately put on public display." She countered, her voice sharp with a logic that fought against the pain in her heart. "This is a frame, Julian, and it's an expert one." "It looks like expert espionage to me," he shot back, his control finally cracking. "It looks like you've been playing a very long, very profitable game." "Then you haven't been looking closely enough," she said, her focus returning to the papers. She pulled out a page detailing the bank transactions. This account was opened a month ago in Grand Cayman. The initial deposit was $10,000. Do you really believe I would sell secrets worth hundreds of millions for a starting payment of $10,000? My price, I assure you, would be considerably higher. Her audacity momentarily stunned him. She wasn't finished. She pointed to one of the copied emails. This is timestamped 10:03 p.m. last Tuesday. At that exact time, you and I were in this room reviewing the security protocols for this very project. I was sitting in that chair. She gestured to the leather armchair. We were not interrupted for 2 hours. I never touched a computer. She could see him processing her words. His mind, the logical, analytical part of him, weighing her defense against the damning evidence. A flicker of doubt entered his eyes. And this, she said, pulling out another document, a supposed internal memo she had leaked. It references Financial Protocol 7B. That protocol was decommissioned 6 weeks ago after we found a security flaw. All new sensitive data is routed through Protocol 9. A genuine internal leak would contain current information. This is based on old data. It's a masterful illusion, but it's created by someone on the outside, someone with access to what was not what is. She laid the pages out, the inconsistencies she had found forming a counter-narrative to the one in the folio. She was fighting back not with pleas of innocence, but with cold, hard facts. She was the expert he had hired, and she was doing her job. Julian stared at the documents, then at her. Her logic was a lifeline, and he clung to it, wanting desperately to believe. But the sheer, overwhelming detail of the forgery, the pure malice of its intent, had shaken him to his core. The seed of doubt so carefully planted by Marcus and his mother had found fertile ground. His mind saw the flaws she indicated, but his gut was still churning with the visceral image of betrayal. Alara saw it in his face, the war raging behind his eyes. He wanted to trust her, but the risk was too great. The wound to his faith was too deep. You still don't believe me, she stated, her voice flat, devoid of accusation. It was a simple, painful observation. Not completely. He stood up, pacing behind the desk like a caged panther. He stopped, running a hand through his hair. His voice, when he finally spoke, was ragged with conflict. What I believe is that you are the most capable person I have ever met, which means you are capable of this. He gestured to the folio. And you are capable of mounting a brilliant defense when caught. The words were a slap in the face. He was twisting her competence, the very reason he'd hired her, into a weapon against her. The contract between us is not terminated, he said, his voice hardening as he made his decision. But the terms have changed. Until I can independently verify your claims and trace the source of this fabrication, your access is restricted. You will not enter the archives, the server rooms, or my father's old offices without my direct authorization and my presence. You will report every conversation, every movement to me directly. From this moment on, you are no longer an independent agent in this house. You are my shadow. Am I clear? The trust between them had been the invisible thread holding their entire enterprise together. With those words, he had severed it. Alara stood, her posture rigid, the hurt in her chest a cold, heavy stone. She would not let him see how much his doubt had wounded her. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting his without flinching. Perfectly. She turned and walked out of the study, the click of the door closing behind her as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. The trap hadn't destroyed her, but it had succeeded in its mission. It had built a wall of suspicion between them, a wall of cold, calculated betrayal. And as she walked down the empty corridor, she knew she was now truly alone. The days that followed were lived in a state of cold, quiet war. The Croft estate, once a labyrinth Alara had been navigating with cautious autonomy, had become a gilded cage. Julian's decree had been absolute. She was his shadow, and he was her warden. Their work in the study became a tense, silent ritual. She would sit at her designated desk, and he at his, the vast expanse of polished mahogany between them, a tangible representation of the chasm that had opened. There were no more shared glances of understanding, no more brief analytical conversations that sparked with an undercurrent of something more. Now there was only the scratch of his pen, the soft click of her keyboard, and the oppressive weight of his constant evaluating gaze. When she needed access to a file, she had to ask his permission. When she wished to speak with a member of the staff, he would accompany her, standing a few feet away. His arms crossed his presence, a clear signal to everyone that she was not to be trusted. He was strangling her investigation, cutting off her access, grounding her. She knew he was doing it to protect his company from the threat he believed she might be, but it felt like a personal betrayal, a slow and steady suffocation of the faith they had once shared. The most painful part was that she could see the conflict tearing him apart. In unguarded moments when he thought she wasn't looking, she would see him watching her. His brow furrowed, his eyes filled with a deep, aching doubt. He was a man trapped between the evidence of his eyes and the instinct of his heart, and the war was leaving him hollowed out. Marcus Thorne observed this new frigid dynamic with immense satisfaction. He had engineered the perfect crack in their alliance, and now he would insert the lever to break it apart completely. He saw Alara's isolation, her frustration. She was a thoroughbred hobbled at the starting gate. A cornered wolf was a dangerous animal, but a cornered and isolated wolf was one that might be desperate enough to consider a new pack. He decided it was time to make his approach. He orchestrated the meeting with the same meticulous care he applied to a hostile takeover. He waited for a day when Julian was called away to an urgent off-site meeting, a meeting Marcus himself had helped arrange. He then had a maid deliver a message to Alara. Mr. Croft requires you to pull the original architectural folios from the main library. He will meet you there upon his return. It was a plausible request. Alara, bound by her new restrictive protocol, had no choice but to comply. The library was a cathedral of knowledge 2 stories high, with towering shelves of dark-scented wood that groaned under the weight of generations of books. A spiral staircase of wrought iron curled up to a second-floor gallery, and stained glass windows cast jeweled patterns of light across the Persian rugs. It was a silent, awe-inspiring space, but today it felt oppressive, the towering books like silent judging witnesses. She found the architectural folios in the archives section, massive leather-bound volumes that required both hands to lift. As she heaved one onto a large reading table, a voice spoke from the shadows behind her. "A heavy burden to carry alone, isn't it, Miss Vance?" Alara didn't startle, but a cold knot formed in her stomach. She turned slowly. Marcus Thorne emerged from between 2 towering shelves, a single book in his hand, his posture one of casual academic interest. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a cool, even tone. "I was under the impression I was meeting Mr. Croft." Julian was unavoidably detained, he said, with a smooth, dismissive wave of his hand. "But his absence provides us with a much-needed opportunity to speak candidly, without a warden watching your every move." He walked closer, his polished shoes making no sound on the thick rug. "It must be frustrating. A woman of your considerable talents reduced to a glorified research assistant on a leash." "My duties are what Mr. Croft requires them to be," she replied, her guard firmly in place. Marcus chuckled, a low, appreciative sound. "Always the professional. It's one of the things I've come to admire about you." He stopped a few feet from the table, his eyes sharp and intelligent. "It must be particularly galling working under such a cloud of suspicion. It must feel familiar. Almost like the St. Clair Gallery incident all over again, wouldn't you say?" The name of the gallery, spoken aloud in this secret-filled room, hit Alara like a physical blow. For a fraction of a second, her mask of composure slipped. She felt a jolt of pure cold fear, the ghost of a past she thought she had buried. She recovered instantly, but he had seen it. He knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice like ice. "Oh, I think you do," he said gently, as if reasoning with a skittish animal. "I was a junior counsel at the firm that represented the gallery's insurance underwriters. I read every page of that case file. A brilliant rising star in art recovery framed for the theft of a Da Vinci. The evidence was planted, of course. Too perfect, too clean, but it was enough to destroy you. You became a ghost. And now here you are, a ghost in a new machine, and history is repeating itself. Another frame, another powerful family, another man who wants to believe you but is too much of a coward to trust his own convictions." He had laid her entire life bare on the library table. He had taken her deepest vulnerability and was holding it in his hand. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked, her voice low and tight. "I want what you want," he said, his tone shifting, becoming conspiratorial. "Justice and power. We have a common enemy, Alara, Isabella. She is the rot at the core of this family. She destroyed your mother's peace of mind, and she is trying to destroy you. Julian. Julian is a disappointment. He has his father's name, but his mother's weakness. He looks at you, and he doesn't see a partner. He sees a risk he can't afford. When the time comes, he will cut you loose to save his empire. He has already proven it. Every word was a carefully aimed dart designed to find the cracks in her resolve. And he was right. Julian's doubt was a constant grinding presence between them. I, on the other hand, Marcus continued leaning against the table. I see an asset, an equal. He paused, letting the weight of his offer fill the silence. Help me. Help me remove Isabella from the board. With my legal acumen and your unique skills, we can expose her for what she is. We can take control of the narrative. And what would be my reward for this treason? Alara asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. Marcus's smile was predatory. First, your name. I was a junior counsel, but I was not idle. I know who truly orchestrated the St. Clair theft. I have the proof, a sworn affidavit from a witness who has been in hiding for 5 years. I can deliver it to the authorities and your name will be cleared. Completely. Alara's breath caught in her throat. To have her name back. To be whole again. It was a siren song, a promise so potent it made her dizzy. And second, he said, delivering the coup de grace, a trust fund. 20% of my shares in the Croft Corporation once I assume control. Enough money to ensure you never have to work in the shadows again. You can rebuild your life, your career, anything you want. All you have to do is help me take the queen, and the prince who hides behind her skirts. He had offered her everything: redemption, wealth, and revenge against the man who was currently treating her like a criminal. He had seen her cage, and he was offering her the key. Her mind reeled. Her loyalty was to her contract with Julian, to the memory of her mother. But Julian's trust was gone, and Marcus was offering her the one thing she had thought was lost forever: her past. She looked at him, at his calm, confident face, and saw the serpent from her mother's diary. He was temptation itself, offering a poisoned apple that tasted of freedom. She did not let him see her turmoil. She straightened up, her expression unreadable. She walked around the table, forcing him to turn to follow her. That is a very interesting proposal, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice as smooth and cool as polished marble. An audacious one. She paused at the library door, turning back to face him. You've given me a great deal to consider. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She left him standing in the Cathedral of Secrets, a confident smile on his face, certain that he had won, that her self-interest would inevitably lead her into his web. But as Alara walked through the silent corridors, her mind was a whirlwind of calculation. Marcus had made a fatal error. In his arrogance, in his attempt to buy her loyalty, he had given her something far more valuable than money, or even revenge. He had given her a new target. He had told her that the proof of her innocence existed. He thought he had laid the perfect gambit. But he had no idea that he had just armed his enemy with a new and infinitely more powerful weapon. The game was no longer just about the past of the Croft family. It was now about reclaiming her own. Marcus Thorne's offer echoed in Alara's mind, a venomous and seductive whisper. He had intended to recruit her, to turn her against Julian with the promise of her own resurrected past. But in his arrogance he had misjudged his target. He saw her as a collection of grievances and ambitions, a pawn to be manipulated. He failed to see the core of her, the unshakable resolve forged in the very fires of the betrayal he was now offering to extinguish. His gambit did not create a new loyalty, it clarified the old one. The mission was no longer just a contract undertaken for a client. It was now inextricably linked to her own liberation. Marcus held the key to her past, and she knew he would never yield it without being forced. To force him, she needed leverage. Not just any leverage, but something absolute, something that could shatter the delicate balance of power within the Croft estate. She needed the truth. And she knew with an instinct that resonated in her very bones that the truth was coiled around the missing heart of the family, the star of the Aegean. She returned to her mother's diary, the small leather-bound book, now feeling less like a relic of the past and more like a map to the future. She read the cryptic entry again and again, letting the words steep in her mind. I have hidden its light where only a shadow can find it. Her first instinct had been to think of literal shadows, the play of light and dark within the estate. But that was too simple, too transient. Her mother and Isabella were intelligent, meticulous women. The hiding place would be clever, a riddle of language and meaning. A shadow. What was a shadow? It was a dark shape cast by an object. It was an inseparable companion. It was an echo, a reflection, a ghost of something real. Her thoughts kept circling back to the library. It was the intellectual and historical heart of the house, a repository of the family's legacy, its official story, and she suspected its unofficial one. A shadow of the truth could easily hide within a mountain of documented facts. Under the guise of organizing Julian's family records, a task he had granted her with cold reluctance, she spent the next 2 days immersed in the library's silence. The work was a perfect cover, allowing her unrestricted access. She started with the library's extensive catalog, a searchable database on a dedicated terminal. She typed the word shadow into the search field. Hundreds of results appeared: novels, histories, philosophical treatises. It was a forest of possibilities too dense to navigate. She refined her thinking. A shadow is a companion. She searched again, this time for titles containing both shadow and companion. One result. A slim, obscure volume of poetry from the 19th century bound in dark blue leather titled The Shadow's Companion. Its author was a forgotten poet named Alistair Finch. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She located the book on a high shelf in the poetry section, a place clearly untouched for years. She ran her fingers over the dusty cover before opening it. The pages were brittle, the poems melancholic and dense. She scanned each one looking for a sign, a mark, an annotation. Nothing. Disappointment was a familiar, bitter taste. She was about to replace the book when she noticed something odd about the library card tucked into a sleeve on the inside back cover. It was an old handwritten card, and it had only ever been checked out once 50 years ago. But tucked behind it, almost completely hidden, was a tiny folded piece of paper. Her fingers trembled as she extracted it. On it, written in her mother's elegant script, was not a word but a number, F17. Arch. Architectural Archives, Folio 17. It wasn't a clue in the book. The book was the clue, a signpost pointing the way. A shadow is an echo, a copy. The book was a copy, and its true purpose was to point to another copy, an architectural plan. The tense silence of her working relationship with Julian now became an obstacle. To access the secure architectural archives, she needed his presence. She approached him that evening in the study, her expression carefully neutral. "I've cross-referenced the property deeds with the early household inventories as you asked," she said, her voice betraying none of her excitement. "There's a discrepancy in the original floor plan for the main library. I need to see the primary folio to be sure, F17. Julian looked up from his work, his gaze analytical. He was suspicious of every request now. What kind of discrepancy? It appears there was a structural modification made to the grand fireplace in the early 20th century that isn't reflected in the later blueprints. It's likely nothing a historical footnote, but it's an inconsistency," she lied smoothly. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching for any hint of deception. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Very well. We'll look at it in the morning." The next day, they entered the climate-controlled archives together. Julian retrieved the folio, a massive, heavy book, and laid it on a viewing table. As he untied the ribbon, Alara's pulse thrummed in her ears. She watched as he turned the heavy parchment pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. He found the page for the library. "I see no modifications," he said, his tone flat. "Allow me," Alara said, moving closer. The faint scent of his cologne of clean linen and subtle spice was a distracting intimacy. She forced herself to focus her finger, tracing the intricate lines of the drawing. "There," she said. "The flue design. Look at the interior dimensions. They don't match the external structure of the chimney breast. There's a void, a hollow space nearly a foot deep running behind the mantel." He leaned in, his own eyes following hers. He saw it too. A subtle, deliberate anomaly hidden in plain sight, a secret that existed only on paper in the shadow of the real thing. His gaze shifted from the blueprint to her face, a flicker of grudging admiration in his eyes. "How did you find this?" "I'm thorough," she replied simply. That night, she waited until the house had fallen into its deepest slumber, until the only sound was the steady ticking of the hall clock. Dressed in black, she slipped into the library. The room was vast and dark, the moonlight painting silver ghosts on the floor. She approached the grand fireplace, a monstrous thing of carved marble. Her hands, covered in thin leather gloves, ran over the cool stone of the mantelpiece, searching. Her mother's clue, the blueprint, it had all led to this. She felt for a seam, a catch, anything. Her fingers found a small, almost invisible irregularity in the carving of an acanthus leaf. She pressed. A low grinding sound shockingly loud in the silence broke the air. A section of the marble mantelpiece as heavy as a tombstone shifted inward, revealing a dark square cavity. Her breath hitched. She reached inside her fingers, brushing against something wrapped in soft, thick cloth. She drew it out. It was heavy, dense. With trembling hands, she unwrapped the layers of faded velvet. And then she saw it. It did not glitter. The star of the Aegean was a stone so deeply and perfectly blue that it seemed to drink the moonlight, swallowing the light and leaving only a void of pure, impossible color. It was the size of a robin's egg, flawlessly cut, and it felt cool and heavy in her palm, a piece of captured midnight. It was the heart of every secret, every lie in this house. This was the light her mother had hidden. A floorboard creaked behind her. I wondered how long it would take you. Alara spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The main library lights flooded the room, blinding her for a second. As her eyes adjusted, she saw Isabella Croft standing by the doorway. She was not flanked by security guards. She was alone, dressed in a silk robe, her posture not one of rage, but of profound, bone-deep weariness. "I assume you're here to accuse me of theft?" Alara said, her voice steady as she tucked the sapphire into her pocket. Isabella gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Theft. My dear girl, that is the one thing your mother and I agreed you would never do. She knew you would find it eventually. She said you had her mind, but a fire she never possessed." Alara stared, completely thrown. This was not the confrontation she had expected. "Put the jewel away," Isabella said, walking slowly into the room. "Its part in this story is over. You came here looking for a murderer, didn't you? You and my son playing detectives, searching for the villain who killed the great Arthur Croft." She stopped before the fireplace, her gaze distant. "You are looking for the wrong story, Miss Vance." She turned her eyes so often, like chips of ice, now looked like shattered glass. "My husband was a monster," she said, her voice low and brittle. "A charming, brilliant, beautiful monster who was determined to burn his own kingdom to the ground for a pretty face in another city. He was drowning in gambling debts. He was having an affair. And he was planning to sell everything, the company, the estate, this very library. He was going to sell the Star of the Aegean and run away with his mistress, leaving Julian and me with nothing but the Croft name and a mountain of debt." Alara stood frozen, the entire foundation of her investigation crumbling beneath her. "Your mother," Isabella continued, her voice softening with a memory that was clearly painful. "Anya was the only person in this house who saw the truth. She was the only person I could talk to. She saw my despair. And together we devised a plan to save the only thing that mattered, Julian's future. Anya, so quiet, so invisible, was the only one who could get close to the sapphire without Arthur noticing. She took it. She stole it, an act of the most profound loyalty a person has ever shown me. And she hid it right where you found it to save this family from the man who was supposed to be its protector." The silence that followed was absolute. Alara looked from the weary, broken woman before her to the heavy weight in her pocket. The villain she had been hunting was a victim. The victim she had been avenging was a monster. And her own mother had not been a casualty of this family's war, but a willing and pivotal soldier. The truth was not a simple matter of murder and inheritance. It was a complex, tragic knot of love, betrayal, and a desperate shared act of survival. The weight of the sapphire in Alara's pocket felt immense, a cold, dense anchor pulling her down into a history she had fundamentally misunderstood. The woman before her was no longer the icy matriarch, the villain of her story. In the harsh light of the library, Isabella Croft was stripped bare, her power and pride peeled away to reveal the brittle, terrified core beneath. The confession hung in the air between them, a ghost that reshaped the very architecture of the room. "My mother helped you." Alara said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. It wasn't a question. It was an attempt to make sense of the new reality. She hid the sapphire to stop him. She did more than that. Isabella whispered, her gaze fixed on the empty fireplace as if watching the ghosts of a decade-old fire. "She saved us." Ilara's mind, trained to see patterns and deceptions, struggled to accept this new narrative. Then what happened to him? If it wasn't about the sapphire, if he wasn't murdered for it, then how did he die? Isabella finally looked at Alara, her eyes swimming with a memory so vivid it was clear she lived with it every day. "Come," she said, her voice raspy. "If you are to know the truth, you must see it." She led Alara from the library through the silent sleeping house to the west wing. They ascended a grand curving staircase to the second floor, to a set of large glass doors that led out onto a wide stone terrace. The night air was cool and damp. Below the estate's gardens were a tapestry of shadow and moonlight. "This is the place," Isabella said, her arms wrapping around herself as if against a sudden chill. It was raining that night. A terrible storm. The kind that makes you feel as though the sky is trying to break the world. She began to speak, her voice low, and haunted a confessional tone that felt utterly alien coming from her. Arthur had been drinking for days. He had finalized the deal to sell a controlling interest in the company, and he had a buyer for the Star of the Aegean. He was euphoric. A wild, destructive energy burned in him. He came to the safe that night to get the jewel, and he found it empty. Isabella walked to the stone balustrade, her hands gripping the cold, damp stone. The rage. I had never seen anything like it. He knew it was me. He knew Anya was the only one I trusted, the only one who could have helped me. He found me here. He dragged me out onto the terrace in the middle of the storm. She painted the scene with brutal, fragmented clarity. Arthur, his face contorted with fury, his words slurring with alcohol and rage. The wind whipping her hair across her face, the rain plastering her gown to her skin. He said he would see me ruined. Isabella recounted, her voice trembling, that he would see Julian begging on the streets before he let me defy him. He said he would tell the world I was mad, that he would have me committed. He was screaming, the sound lost in the thunder. He grabbed my arm. Her hand went to her own forearm, a ghostly memory of his grip. He was strong. He shook me, demanding to know where the sapphire was. I refused to tell him. I told him he had destroyed everything else, but he would not destroy his son's future. That was when he lunged for me. It wasn't to hurt me, not really. It was a final, desperate attempt to break my will, to force the answer from me. Her breath hitched, a dry, painful sob. I stumbled backward away from him. My heel slipped on the wet stone. To stop myself from falling, I grabbed onto his arm. My sudden weight, his drunken momentum. It was all it took. He lost his footing. For a single horrifying second, we were balanced there on the edge of the world. Then my grip broke. She stared out into the darkness, her eyes seeing not the peaceful gardens, but the terrifying rain-swept drop. He went over. I didn't hear him scream. Just the wind, and then a sound. A terrible final sound from the courtyard below. And then silence. A silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. She was crying now, silent tears tracing paths through her carefully applied makeup. I just stood there in the rain, paralyzed. My first thought was not of grief, it was of terror. They would say I pushed him. Our arguments were legendary among the staff. His plans to leave me were already a whisper in our social circle. They would see his rage my defiance, and they would call it murder. As Isabella's story hung in the chilled air, a figure emerged from the shadows of her memory, a beacon of calm in the heart of the storm. "Anya found me," Isabella whispered. "Your mother." She must have heard the shouting. She came out onto the terrace and saw me standing there, and she saw him. Below. I was catatonic. I think I would have thrown myself over the balustrade to follow him if she hadn't been there. In Isabella's telling, Anya Vance transformed from a simple maid into a figure of incredible strength and resolve. It was not Isabella who had orchestrated the cover-up. It was Anya. She pulled me back inside. Isabella continued, her voice filled with a decade of awe and gratitude. She slapped my face hard to break the hysteria, and she said the words that saved my life. "They will destroy you," she told me. "They will not see an accident. They will see an opportunity. They will take the company and they will destroy the boy to get to it. We must protect the boy." It was Anya who had thought of everything. She had wiped away the signs of their struggle from the terrace. She had fixed Isabella's torn dress. She had guided the shaking, traumatized matriarch back to her room and given her a sedative, creating an alibi. She was the one who had made the anonymous call to the police hours later, reporting a tragic accident, her voice disguised with grief. She had done it all, a silent, fiercely loyal general commanding a retreat from total annihilation. She saved my life, my freedom, and Julian's future. All in one night, Isabella said, finally turning to face Alara. And in return, all she asked was that I promise to be the mother to Julian that his father never was. to guide the company with strength and integrity. The full devastating weight of the truth settled upon Alara. Her mother hadn't just been a maid, she had been the secret pillar of the House of Croft. Then why, Alara asked, her voice cracking with the emotion of it all. If you owed her so much, why were you so cruel to me? Why did you try to destroy me? Isabella's gaze fell, her face crumpling with a shame that seemed to age her in an instant. Because I am not the woman your mother was, Miss Vance. I am a coward. For 10 years that secret has been a poison in my soul, and your mother was the only other person who knew. When she died, I thought the ghost of that night was finally buried with her. She looked up, her eyes pleading for an understanding she knew she didn't deserve. Then Julian brought you here. And you were not just a girl. You were her daughter. You have her eyes, her intelligence, but you have a fire, a fearlessness that she kept hidden. When I looked at you, I saw her ghost rising and I was terrified. I saw my entire world, the world your mother saved, threatening to unravel. My cruelty to you, she confessed, the words tasting like acid, was born of that terror. I hated you because you were a living reminder of my own weakness, of the secret that proved I was not the untouchable matriarch I pretended to be. I resented that my fate was once again tied to a Vance woman I was supposed to command. Every time you stood up to me, every time you showed your strength, you reminded me of her. And I tried to crush you the way the world would have crushed me if not for her. It was unforgivable. It was monstrous. But my fear was greater than my conscience. The confession was complete. It lay between them, a raw and ugly thing, but it was the truth. The library, the sapphire, the investigation, it had all led to this moment on a dark terrace where the story was not of murder, but of a tragic accident, a desperate cover-up, and the fierce, unlikely bond between a queen and her handmaiden. Alara looked at the woman she had considered her enemy, a woman who had tried to ruin her, and for the first time she saw not a monster, but a terrified prisoner of her own past. The lines had not just blurred, they had been erased completely. And Alara, holding the secret of it all in her hands, was left with a choice far more complex than she had ever imagined. The confession on the terrace did not bring peace. It brought a strange, fragile, and deeply unsettling truce. The animosity that had defined the relationship between Alara and Isabella had evaporated, replaced by the shared gravity of a decade-old secret. They returned to the library, the cavernous room now a sanctuary for their shared history. The star of the Aegean sat on the polished table between them, its deep blue heart absorbing the lamplight, no longer a symbol of wealth, but a silent witness. Marcus Thorne Alara said, her voice low in the quiet room. He called himself the serpent in a garden. Your husband's and now yours. Isabella looked up, her face pale. What do you mean? He approached me, Alara explained, detailing the gambit in the library. She told Isabella everything: Marcus's knowledge of her past, his offer of exoneration, his plan to oust her. He knows who I am. He has been watching this house, waiting for a fracture. He didn't cause the weakness in your family, Isabella. He just waited for it. He is the one my mother was afraid of. The realization dawned on Isabella's face, a slow, creeping horror. The loyal family lawyer, the man who had been her confidant after Arthur's death, the one who had helped her navigate the treacherous corporate waters, had been a predator in disguise, circling for a decade. All this time, she whispered, her voice trembling with a new kind of fury. He has been playing us all against each other. He is playing his endgame now, Alara stated. He tried to use me to get to you. When that failed, he will move to burn the entire board down. A bond was formed in that moment, not of friendship, but of a shared and imminent threat. For the first time, they were not queen and servant or accuser and accused. They were two women staring into the abyss with the fate of their world hanging in the balance. The storm broke not with a thunderclap, but with the shrill, insistent ring of a telephone at dawn. A frantic call from the head of the Croft Corporation's PR department jolted the estate from its uneasy slumber. It was followed moments later by the morning papers delivered by a trembling butler. The headline screamed from the front page of the Charleston Herald in thick, black, damning letters. A decade of deceit did the Croft matriarch murder her husband. The story was a masterpiece of malicious fiction expertly woven by Marcus. It contained just enough truth to be believable and just enough poison to be lethal. It detailed the violent, unhappy marriage of Arthur and Isabella Croft. It spoke of a secret, long-time accomplice, a loyal maid named Anya Vance. It painted a picture of a final furious argument on the West Terrace culminating in Isabella in a fit of rage pushing her husband over the balustrade. But Marcus's masterstroke was how he twisted the present. The article claimed that Anya's daughter Ilara, a disgraced former investigator, had now infiltrated the Croft estate. It alleged she had used her knowledge of her mother's complicity to blackmail her way into a position of power, seducing the weak-willed heir Julian, and positioning herself to take control of the family fortune. It was a perfect narrative of greed, murder, and corruption. It made Isabella a killer, Ilara a blackmailer, and Julian a fool. And it implicitly positioned the source of the leak, an unnamed courageous insider, as the hero trying to save the company from the rot within. The siege began within the hour. News vans swarmed the main gates like angry hornets, their satellite dishes raised to the sky. Reporters shouted questions at the stoic security guards. Helicopters began to circle overhead, their rhythmic chopping sound, a constant invasive heartbeat. The phones inside the estate rang incessantly, calls from horrified board members, panicked investors, and gloating rivals. The House of Croft, a bastion of privacy and power, had become a public spectacle, its deepest secret now a feeding frenzy for the entire world. Julian, who had been woken by the chaos, stormed into the main parlor, a newspaper crushed in his fist, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He found his mother standing by the window, staring out at the media circus, her body rigid with shock. "Mother," he demanded, his voice raw, "what is this? Tell me this is a lie." Isabella turned from the window, her face ashen. The fight had gone out of her. In the face of this public evisceration, all that was left was a broken woman. "It is a lie, Julian," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But it is wrapped around a terrible truth." And so, with the roar of news helicopters as a backdrop, she confessed everything to her son. She told him about his father's cruelty, the plan to ruin them, her desperation, and the accident on the terrace. She told him about Anya's loyalty, about the cover-up designed to protect him. As Julian listened, his own world tilted on its axis. The father he had mourned was a monster. The mother he had resented was a victim. The maid he had doubted was the daughter of the woman who had saved him. The entire history of his life was a lie he had never thought to question. While he was still reeling, the official email arrived from the board of directors. It was a curt, brutal summons. An emergency meeting was called for 3 o'clock that afternoon. The sole item on the agenda was a vote of no confidence in the Croft family, seeking the immediate removal of both Isabella and Julian from their executive positions and their seats on the board. Marcus had timed his coup perfectly. Ilara found Julian in his study. He was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by the ringing phones and the chaos outside, looking utterly lost. The weight of his name, his legacy, and a decade of secrets was crashing down on him all at once. She walked straight to him, her expression calm and focused. She was no longer his shadow, no longer the woman under suspicion. In the heart of the storm, she was the only still point. "It's Marcus," she said simply. "This is his move. He created the chaos so he can present himself as the only one who can restore order." Julian looked at her, his eyes wild with confusion and betrayal. "My mother, she just told me." "I know," Ilara said softly. "She told me last night. The truth." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the Star of the Aegean. She placed the heavy, cool jewel into his hand. "This is the truth, Julian. Not a story of murder, but a story of desperation. Your mother and mine did what they had to do to protect you." He stared at the sapphire, then back at her face. In that moment, with his world in flames, the last vestiges of his doubt burned away. The meticulous evidence in the folio, the whispers, the staged scenes, they all seemed like cheap parlor tricks compared to the profound, tragic weight of the jewel in his hand and the unwavering clarity in her eyes. He had been a fool, consumed by a suspicion that had been manufactured for him from the very beginning. "I have something else," Ilara said, her voice pulling him back from the edge. She laid a slim data drive on his desk. "I haven't been idle these past few weeks. I suspected Marcus was the serpent from my mother's diary. While I was officially grounded, I used my back-channel resources to look into him. That drive contains proof of his own corruption. Illegal stock trades, accepting bribes to sabotage a rival firm 3 years ago. It's all there. He's been building his own lifeboat while planning to sink yours." For the first time since the news had broken, a flicker of the old defiant fire returned to Julian's eyes. He looked from the jewel to the data drive to Ilara. She was not the source of his problem. She was his only solution. She was not a liability. She was his greatest asset. His love for her, which had been battered and tested by doubt, now surged with a new and powerful clarity. He picked up the phone on his desk, silencing the incoming call with a sharp jab of his finger. He looked at Alara, a silent apology, and a world of gratitude passing between them. He then turned to the intercom, his voice no longer lost, but sharp and resonant with command. "Get my mother," he said. "Tell her to meet us in the study. Immediately." He took a deep, steadying breath. "Then get the entire legal team on a conference line and send a message to the board. Inform them that we will be attending their 3 o'clock meeting." He paused, his gaze locking with Alara's. "And that we have a presentation of our own." The siege was on, but now they were no longer hiding behind the walls. They were preparing to march out and face the enemy armed not with lies, but with the one weapon Marcus Thorne had never anticipated: the complete and unvarnished truth. The emergency board meeting was convened in a room that felt like the inside of a vault. It was a cold, sterile space on the top floor of the Croft Corporation's downtown headquarters, dominated by a monolithic granite table that reflected the grim faces of the 12 men and women who would decide the fate of an empire. The air was thick with the scent of fear and money. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the table, a position he had assumed with the predatory grace of a usurper. He was the picture of calm, sober leadership, his suit immaculate, his expression one of grave concern. He had positioned himself as the savior, the steady hand ready to steer the ship away from the rocks of a dynastic scandal. The doors opened, and a hush fell over the room. Julian entered first, his posture straight, his face set with a resolve that no one in that room had ever seen in him before. He was followed by Alara, a silent, composed figure at his side, her presence a defiant counterpoint to the lurid headlines. Finally, Isabella Croft entered. She was not the imperious queen they knew, but a woman stripped of her armor, her dignity found not in pride, but in a quiet, humbling penance. The three of them formed an unlikely embattled phalanx against the hostile board. "Thank you for coming, Julian." Isabella Marcus began, his tone dripping with false magnanimity. "This is a difficult day for us all. In light of the devastating allegations that have come to light, the board has been left with no choice but to consider a change in leadership to protect our shareholders and the future of this company." He gestured to the newspapers laid out on the table. "The court of public opinion has already reached its verdict. Our task now is damage control." Before he could continue, Julian stepped forward. "The court of public opinion has been fed a lie, Marcus, and this board is about to be fed another." His voice was not loud, but it resonated with an authority that commanded the room's absolute attention. "You've all read the papers. You've heard the whispers. Now you will hear the truth." For the next hour, Julian held the board captive. He did not defend, he confessed. He laid bare the secret history of his family with a raw, unflinching honesty that was more powerful than any legal defense. He told them of his father Arthur Croft not as the visionary founder, but as the reckless tyrant who had nearly destroyed his own creation. He spoke of his gambling, his affair, and his plan to liquidate the company's assets, leaving them all in ruin. Then he turned the floor over to his mother. Isabella stood, her hands clasped before her. She did not make excuses or beg for pity. She simply spoke the truth, her voice steady with the weight of a decade of silence. "My husband's death was an accident," she said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "It was a tragic, ugly accident that occurred while I was trying to stop him from destroying everything we had all built. In my fear and my grief, I made a choice. I chose to protect my son and this company from a scandal that would have consumed us. I chose to hide the circumstances of that night. It was a choice born of desperation, and it was wrong. I was aided in this by a woman of profound loyalty and strength, Anya Vance." She looked directly at Alara, her mother. A wave of shocked murmurs filled the room. This was not the story they had read. This was something far more complex and human. At that moment, Julian stepped forward again. He reached into his briefcase and produced a velvet pouch. With a deliberate movement, he opened it and placed the Star of the Aegean on the center of the granite table. The effect was instantaneous. The legendary long-lost jewel seemed to pull all the light in the room into its impossibly blue depths. It was real. The myth was real. "This sapphire," Julian announced, his voice ringing with conviction, is the heart of this story. It was not stolen in a murder plot as the papers suggest. It was hidden. Anya Vance and my mother hid it to prevent my father from selling it. They did not act out of greed or malice. They acted to save the Croft Corporation. An act of loyalty that has been twisted into a weapon by the very man who now proposes to lead this company. All eyes swung to Marcus, whose serene composure had finally begun to crack. A faint sheen of sweat was visible on his brow. The sensational story you all read this morning, Julian continued, was a fabrication fed to the press by a man who has been playing a very long game. He nodded to Alara. Alara stepped forward and inserted a slim data drive into the port at the head of the table. A projector whirred to life, casting an image onto the screen behind Julian. It was an org chart not of the Croft Corporation, but of Marcus's network of shell companies and offshore accounts. For the past 5 years, Julian narrated as Alara clicked through a devastating series of slides. Mr. Thorne has engaged in a pattern of corruption. He has used his position as corporate counsel to engage in illegal insider trading. He has accepted bribes to sabotage competitors. And most recently, he has systematically manufactured this crisis-feeding doctored information to the press and planting forged evidence, all with the aim of seizing control of this board. The final slide was a secretly recorded audio file. Marcus's voice filled the room, smooth and confident from his meeting with Alara in the library. Help me remove her from the board. In return, I'll provide a sworn affidavit exonerating you in the St. Clair case. I have the proof. The boardroom erupted. The board members stared at Marcus, their faces a mixture of shock and pure rage. They had been played, their company brought to the brink of ruin by the man they were about to install as their leader. This is an outrage, a fabrication. Marcus stammered, his face pale. His mask of control shattered. Is it? Julian countered, his voice like ice. Then I invite you to remain here while we call the federal authorities. They will be very interested in your offshore accounts and the witness in the St. Clair case whose affidavit you seem to have in your possession. Checkmate. Marcus Thorne, the master manipulator, stared at the faces around the table and saw no allies, only ruin. He pushed his chair back, a strangled sound in his throat, and practically fled the room, leaving a stunned and furious board in his wake. In the ensuing silence, Julian addressed them one last time. This company has been poisoned by secrets for too long. Today that ends. He looked at Isabella. My mother will be tendering her resignation from the board effective immediately. Isabella nodded, a tear tracing its way down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of relief. I will be taking her place, Julian continued, and I intend to lead this company into a new era, one built not on the fragile foundations of image and silence, but on the bedrock of transparency and truth. And I will not be doing it alone. He turned and took Alara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Alara Vance will be joining the executive committee as our new chief risk officer. Her skills have already saved this company. Her integrity will help us rebuild it. He stood before them, no longer the hesitant heir, but a leader forged in the fires of crisis. The vote was a mere formality. The motion of no confidence was unanimously defeated. The siege was over. Days later, Alara stood with Julian on the west terrace. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The media circus was gone. Marcus was facing a mountain of federal charges, and a quiet, fragile peace had settled over the estate. Isabella had departed the day before, moving to a smaller family home in the countryside. Her final words to Alara had been a simple whispered, "Thank you for showing my son what courage looks like." The air between Alara and Julian was no longer charged with tension or suspicion. It was calm, clear, and filled with unspoken possibilities. It won't be easy, Julian said softly, watching the sunrise. Rebuilding the company's reputation, my family's name. It will take years. Nothing worth doing ever is, Alara replied, her hand resting on the cool stone of the balustrade. He turned to her, his blue eyes clear and full of a deep, unwavering emotion. The contract between us is over, Alara. But I'd like to propose a new partnership. One with no end date. One built not on secrets, but on everything we've been through. He took her hand, his touch warm and firm. In business and in life, if you'll have me. Alara looked at him, at the man who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. The man who had finally learned that legacy was not something you inherit, but something you build. She thought of her mother, of the quiet strength and fierce loyalty that had been her true inheritance. The shadows had passed. "Yes," she said, a real radiant smile finally reaching her eyes. "I will." They stood together hand in hand as the sun climbed higher, casting its golden light over a world that was theirs to rebuild. The road ahead was long, but for the first time they would walk it together in the light. The story of the sapphire's shadow teaches us a powerful lesson about the nature of truth. It reminds us that secrets, especially those kept to protect a legacy, can become a poison that corrodes from within. True strength is not found in the flawless image we present to the world, but in the courage to face the messy, complicated, and often painful reality of our own history. Julian and Alara's journey shows that trust is not a given. It is a choice, one that must be made again and again, especially in the face of doubt. It illustrates that a legacy built on truth, however difficult that truth may be, is infinitely stronger than an empire built on silence. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you were moved by this journey of truth and redemption, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It helps share these stories with others who may find strength and inspiration in them. We appreciate your time and your support more than words can say. Until next time, may your own stories be filled with courage.